At Westminster Abbey on the 20th of November 1947, as Princess Elizabeth moved toward the altar, a footman standing near the choir screen later swore the young naval lieutenant beside her leaned a fraction, dropped his voice below the organ, and breathed 6 quiet words about the woman the whole country believed he had just won. She was never really ours. If untold palace stories like this one are why you are here, subscribing costs nothing, and more are already queued. The bell means you will actually see them. Picture it. The most photographed wedding of the century, and the groom is looking the wrong way, because the country was told a fairy tale, and it swallowed it whole. Rationing was still on. Britain was grey, tired, patched at the elbows, and here, for one bright morning, was a spectacle. 2,000 guests inside the Abbey, kings and queens from across a shrinking Europe crammed into the pews. Crowds banked 10 deep along the route, breathing steam into the cold, waiting hours for a glimpse of a glass coach. The princess in ivory silk, seed pearls sewn into the train by hand, trumpets, the great west doors, a future queen marrying a dashing naval officer for love. That was the story. That is still the story most people carry in their heads today. And it was, in the ordinary sense, true. She did love him. He did love her. Nobody standing in that crowd was being lied to about the affection. They were being lied to about the price. Now, the footman. His account only surfaced later, quietly, the way most of these things do, passed to a colleague years afterward, rather than shouted to a newspaper. He had a fixed position for the ceremony, close to the choir screen, that carved stone barrier that divides the Abbey. From there, he had a clear side-on view of the couple as they came together before the Archbishop, close enough to watch faces, close enough, he said, to notice where a man's eyes go when he thinks no one is watching them. And Philip's eyes, according to him, were not on his bride. That is the detail that stops you. A groom on his wedding day, at the single most scrutinized moment of his life, and his gaze keeps sliding off the woman in white. Not out of coldness. The footman was careful about that. He drifted, the man said, to the edges, to the ranks of courtiers in their stiff collars, to the archbishops in their heavy vestments, to the household officials arranged in careful order around the altar, each one a small cog in something enormous. Philip was looking at the machinery. He was watching the apparatus of the crown arrange itself silently around the 21-year-old beside him. And it was then, the footman said, that he leaned in and spoke those 6 words. She was never really ours. Hold on to those 6 words. By the end you will hear them completely differently than you do right now. Because the easy reading is the ugly one, a bitter man, a hard man, marrying up, already resentful of the family he was joining. That is how his critics would paint him for decades. But listen to the words again, and they do not point at himself at all. Not I have lost her. Not she was taken from me. She was never really ours. Ours. He is speaking for the family. He is speaking almost from the outside, like a man reporting a fact he can see and they cannot. It was not a lover's complaint. It was a verdict. Philip was 26 years old on that altar. Age 26, in a borrowed uniform, standing where the whole world could see him, and he had already understood something the courtiers around him would spend the next 5 years refusing to admit. He had not married a private woman. He had married a woman the crown had already claimed, long before he ever met her, and the wedding was not the beginning of their life together. It was the ceremony where the institution took formal possession. He could see the cage. He just could not see anyone else in the building who could. To understand how a 26-year-old naval lieutenant could look at his own wedding and see a trap, You have to understand where he came from, because almost nobody does. He was born a prince, Prince of Greece and Denmark no less, into a royal house on a Mediterranean island, which sounds like the opening of a fairy tale of its own. It was not. He was born on a kitchen table on Corfu in 1921, and within 18 months that whole world came apart. His uncle, the King of Greece, was forced off the throne. His father was arrested, tried, and very nearly shot. A revolution does not wait for a baby to be old enough to travel, so they smuggled him out. There was no glass coach for the infant prince. A British warship carried the family away, and the story that stuck, the one told again and again, is that the baby Philip was carried down to safety in a fruit crate, carried out of Corfu in a fruit crate wedged with blankets so he would not roll, a prince of the blood packed like produce for export. Whether every detail is literal barely matters. It is true in the way it counts. He began life as a bundle handed over a ship's rail, a child whose royal title was worth exactly nothing the moment the politics turned. And it never really stopped. What followed was a childhood with no fixed address, his family scattered. His mother, after years of strain, was placed in a sanatorium, and for a long stretch he barely saw her. His father drifted to the south of France. His 4 sisters married and moved into Germany, and Philip was passed along hand to hand across Europe, a term with relatives in France, a spell with his grandmother in England, school in Germany, then hurriedly out of Germany as the 1930s darkened, and on to Gordonstown in the north of Scotland. He spent holidays as other people's guest. He had uncles instead of a home. Someone who knew him in those years said he owned almost nothing, that he arrived at school with a single trunk and left with the same one, stateless, penniless, a prince on paper, and a permanent visitor everywhere else. That is the boy. And here is why it matters for the whisper. A man raised like that learns one lesson down to the bone. He learns exactly what it means to belong to no one. He knows the particular ache of it, the feeling of being welcome but never quite owned, always slightly outside the circle looking in. So when a young man like that meets a girl, and it turns out that girl belongs to a country, belongs to it so completely that millions of strangers feel they have a claim on her, he, of all people, is going to notice. He has spent his whole life on the outside of belonging. He can spot the walls of it instantly. He knows a cage when he sees one, because he has spent his life on the wrong side of every door. And make no mistake, he did meet that girl. And he did fall. This is the part that gets flattened by the cynics, so let us be fair about it. The courtship was real. They had first crossed paths as children, but it was in 1939 when the 13-year-old Elizabeth watched the tall, blonde cadet at Dartmouth that biographers agree something took hold. She kept his photograph. Through the war years they wrote to each other, a naval officer at sea and a princess at home, and those letters, the ones that survive, and the recollections of friends who saw them together, do not read like a strategic match. They read like 2 young people genuinely, stubbornly attached. Elizabeth, by every account of those close to her, had decided on him early and never wavered. This was not an arrangement dressed up as romance. The romance was the true part, which is exactly what makes the rest so sharp, because loving her was never going to be enough. In 1947, the firm, the household machine that ran the monarchy, made its terms plain, and the terms were all pointed at him. A penniless foreign prince with German brothers-in-law and a defeated continent behind him was not a comfortable match for the heir to the British throne. So before he could marry her, He was quietly, thoroughly remade. He gave up his Greek and Danish royal titles, Prince of Greece and Denmark, the one inheritance he actually carried, signed away. He changed his religion, leaving the Greek Orthodox Church he had been baptized into and being received into the Church of England. And he gave up his name. The house of his father was Schleswig-Holstein-Sonderburg-Glücksburg, unspeakable in post-war Britain, so he took his mother's anglicised family name instead and stepped forward as plain Lieutenant Philip Mountbatten, a naturalised British subject, a commoner technically, on the morning he could still have called himself a prince. Strip it down and look at what actually happened. He surrendered his titles. He surrendered his church. He surrendered his very name. By any accounting at the table that day, Philip is the one who paid. He walked into that marriage having given up almost everything a man can be asked to give up and still be himself. And here is the quiet irony you should hold on to, because the whole story turns on it. The man who gave up everything was the one who understood that she was going to lose the most. Think about how strange that is. He is the one stripped of his name and his nation. She is the one gaining a crown, the most exalted position in the land. By every visible measure, she is ascending and he is shrinking. That is certainly how the courtiers saw it, the difficult foreigner who should be grateful. And yet the footman's 6 words say the opposite. Philip looks past his own losses, which were real and fresh and must have stung, and he looks at his bride, and what he sees coming for her is bigger than anything being taken from him. He can see that the titles and the name were things he owned and could hand over. What was going to be taken from Elizabeth was not a possession, it was her. That is the gap this whole story lives in. The gap between the fairy tale the country was sold and the verdict the groom delivered under his breath. The world watched a woman marry up and a lucky officer marry a princess. Philip watched the machinery close a door, and he named it once quietly, to no one but the heir, and a footman happened to be standing near the choir screen to catch it. Now, if the story ended there, he would just be a gloomy young man who read the worst into his own wedding. And for a while, a genuine while, it looked as though that is exactly what he was. Because the early married years seemed to prove the whisper flatly wrong. For a brief bright window, the cage simply was not there. There was a posting to Malta, and a young woman who drove her own car along the coast roads, and dinners with no protocol at all, and staff who remembered her laughing more freely than they would ever see her laugh again. An ordinary naval wife in the Mediterranean sun. The verdict looked like paranoia. The whisper looked like nonsense. Until a single night in a Kenyan garden in February 1952, when it fell to Philip himself to walk his wife outside and tell her something that would end the private woman forever. Malta, 1949 to 1951, 2 years. And for those 2 years, the whisper looked like nothing more than a young man's paranoia. Because on the island, Philip was not a prince waiting in the wings. He was a serving naval officer, a lieutenant commanding his own ship, gone at sea for stretches and back on the quay in his whites like any other man in the fleet. He worked. He had a job with a rank and a duty roster, and for once in his life, he was measured by what he did, rather than by whose grandson he was. And Elizabeth was simply his wife. She drove her own car. Picture that for a second. The woman who would spend the rest of her life in the back seat of a state Bentley, a chauffeur in front and a detective beside him, was in Malta behind the wheel herself, going where she wanted, when she wanted. She went to the hairdresser like anyone else. She had dinner with the other officers' wives, and there were no courtiers hovering at the doorway, No equerry counting the minutes, no protocol deciding who spoke to her first. Staff who saw her in those years remembered one thing above everything else. She laughed, freely, easily. The kind of laugh that comes when nobody is watching to see how a princess laughs. They said she was more relaxed on that island than they would ever see her again. Not once in all the decades that followed. That window in Malta was the freest Elizabeth would ever be, and the people closest to her knew it while it was happening. For 2 years, the man who whispered that she was never really theirs was watching his wife live an ordinary, happy life. A house near the water, a husband with a real job, a car she drove herself. It looked, for a little while, like he had been wrong. For 2 years, he was wrong. Enjoy it, because it doesn't last. Think about what Malta actually was, in the whole shape of this marriage. It was the exception that made the rule visible. Everything before it had been apprenticeship for the throne, and everything after it would be the throne itself. Malta sat in the middle, a couple of years stolen out of a life that belonged to the crown, and Philip knew exactly what it was, even as he lived it. He had seen the machinery at the altar. He knew it had not gone away. It had only, for the length of a naval posting, let go of her hand. And here is the cruel part of it. Those 2 happy years are precisely what make what comes next unbearable. If Elizabeth had never tasted the ordinary, she could not have lost it. You cannot grieve a freedom you never had. Malta gave her the one thing that would make the cage feel like a cage. It showed her, and it showed him, exactly what the other life could have been. So hold Malta in your mind. The harbour, the laughing, the car. Because the palace never talks about Malta for long, and there is a reason for that. 1952, February. The couple were on tour, standing in for her father, King George VI, whose health had been quietly failing for longer than the public was told. He had lung surgery the year before. The official word was recovery. The private truth, known to a handful of doctors and aides, was that the king was a dying man putting on a brave face at an airport. He stood on the tarmac at London Airport in the cold, bareheaded, watching his daughter's plane climb into the sky. It is one of the last photographs of him. A gaunt man in a heavy coat, waving up at an aircraft, carrying the daughter he would never see again. Elizabeth did not know that. She thought she was going on a tour. She thought she would come home. They flew to Kenya, and in the Aberdare forest, up in the branches of a giant fig tree, there was a lodge. It was called Treetops, a wooden platform built high off the ground so guests could watch elephant and rhino come to the waterhole below in the dark. Elizabeth and Philip climbed up into it on the night of the 5th of February, 1952, and spent the evening watching animals move through the moonlight beneath them. There is a line the world would repeat for decades afterward from the hunter who guided them, and it has the terrible neatness of something written after the fact. He said that a princess climbed up into that tree and a queen climbed down. Because while Elizabeth slept in the branches over the African waterhole 7,000 kilometres away at Sandringham, her father died in his sleep. King George VI had gone to bed at Sandringham on the night of the 5th. A servant brought his morning tea on the 6th and could not wake him. He had died in the small hours, quietly, of a coronary thrombosis. He was 56 years old, and across the world his daughter did not yet know she was queen. The news did not arrive cleanly. How could it? There was no direct line to a treehouse in the Kenyan forest. It came the way the worst news often does, in pieces. First a wire reaching the local reporters, then a rumour running through the staff at the Royal Lodge, where the couple had moved on to rest. Then, slowly, confirmation climbing its way up the chain towards the one person who most needed to hear it and least wanted to. And this is the moment. This is the second landing point of the whole story, and everything the footman heard at the altar comes due right here, because it fell to Philip to tell her. Of all the people who could have told her, it was him. Think about what that cost him to say. Not a courtier, not an aide with a prepared line, not the private secretary whose job it technically was, her husband, the man who, 5 years earlier, had leaned toward her at the altar and breathed that she was never really theirs, was now the man who had to make those words true out loud. An aide woke Philip first. Philip took the news the way you take a blow you have half expected your whole life. Then he asked to be alone with her, and he walked his wife out into the garden. We do not have her face. We do not have the exact words. What we have is the quiet testimony of the people around them, who understood they were watching something they had no right to watch. Philip took Elizabeth away from the house, out among the trees, where no one could see, and there, in a garden in Kenya, a 25-year-old woman learned in the same breath that her father was dead and that she was Queen of the United Kingdom. Grief and coronation in a single sentence. There was no space between the two. The moment she lost her father was the moment she gained a crown, and she could not have one without the other. They walked together for a while, up and down slowly, his head bent toward hers. And then it was over, and the machinery that had waited 5 years reached out and took her. An aide, who saw Philip afterward, described him in words that have never been improved on. He said Philip looked like a man who had lost, not gained. Read that again. His wife had just become queen. By every public measure, the family had risen to the very top of the world. And the man beside the new sovereign did not look like a man whose fortunes had soared. He looked bereaved. He looked like someone had died and taken something of his with them, because something of his had died. The private woman ended in that garden. The wife from Malta, the one who drove her own car and laughed without an audience, walked into those trees and did not walk out. What walked out was the Queen, and the Queen belonged to everyone but him. This is the exact point where the whisper stops being a fear and becomes a fact. At the altar in 1947, she was never really ours had been a young man's dark prediction, a verdict on a future he could see coming. In the garden at Treetops, it came true in real time, in front of witnesses, on a specific morning in February. He had said it as a warning. Now he had said it as an announcement. There was no daylight left between the two. And notice what that does to a question you may already be asking. Philip was the one who gave things up, the titles, the name, the religion. On paper, he sacrificed and she inherited. So how could the whisper mean that she lost the most? The garden answers it. He handed over documents and a surname and a passport. She handed over herself. He watched, in one morning, his wife dissolve into an institution, and he understood, standing among the trees, that he would spend the rest of his life one step behind a woman he could no longer fully reach. The man who gave everything up had, in the end, lost far less than the woman who was told she had won, and the tightening did not wait a decent interval. It began that same day. They had to get her home, and getting the Queen home is not the same as booking a flight. There was a black dress. This is one of those small, true details that tells you everything. A member of the sovereign is expected to arrive in mourning, and Elizabeth had packed for a sunny tour, not a father's death. So a black mourning outfit had to be carried out to the aircraft and kept ready, because the woman who had left Britain as a princess could not be seen stepping back onto British soil as queen in anything but black. She changed on the plane. She descended the aircraft steps into a grey London afternoon in that dark dress, small and composed, and at the bottom of the steps stood the officials of the realm, the men in black coats, waiting to receive their new sovereign. Philip came down the steps too, one step behind her, and that is where he would stay. Watch that arrival, and you can see the machinery he described at the altar, finally, plainly, doing its work. At Westminster Abbey 5 years earlier, the closing of the cage had been invisible, something only a man who had grown up belonging to no one could sense in a room full of celebration. Now it was out in the open, the dark dress, the waiting officials, the precedents, the protocol, the men who now decided where the Duke of Edinburgh could stand and where he could not. Everything he had felt as a chill at the altar was now the visible shape of their daily life. If you have felt the pull of these stories, the ones the palace smoothed over and the ones staff remembered differently, subscribing costs nothing, and there are more of them already waiting. The bell is what makes sure you actually see them. Then stay with me, because the machinery had only just turned toward her. Now it turned toward him. Here is what most people never understand about that garden in Kenya. Elizabeth's transformation was the headline. Philip's was the story underneath it, the moment she became queen. The institution that had claimed her stopped being something that happened around him and became something that happened to him. He was no longer the naval officer with a job and a ship. He was the consort, the man who walks behind. And an institution that has just absorbed a woman entirely does not leave the man beside her untouched. Within days, before the funeral was even done, the first battle began. And of all the things they could have taken from him, they went for the one thing a stateless man had left to give. Not his rank, not his career, though that was gone too. His name. Because the moment she became queen, the machinery Philip had watched at the altar turned on him directly, and the first fight was over the surname their children would carry. Winston Churchill and Queen Mary were about to inform the Duke of Edinburgh that his own children would not bear it. The one thing a prince had carried out of Corfu, the one inheritance he could still hand down, and the crown was already reaching for it. The verdict came down in the early 1950s, and it was blunt. The royal house would remain the House of Windsor, not Mountbatten. Winston Churchill, back as Prime Minister, and Queen Mary, the old matriarch who had watched 3 reigns come and go, agreed on it without much argument. The dynasty her son George V had built would keep its name. Elizabeth signed the declaration, and with a stroke of a pen, the children she and Philip would raise became Windsors, every one of them. Think about what that meant to the man it landed on. He had already given up his Greek and Danish titles. He had given up his religion. He had taken a borrowed surname, Mountbatten, from his uncle, because he arrived in England with no usable name of his own. And now even that borrowed name was denied to his own sons and daughters. Biographers record his reaction in words that have never quite lost their sting. He was, he said, the only man in the country not allowed to give his children his name. Nothing but a bloody amoeba. That was the phrase that got back to the staff. And here is the cruelty of it. A prince had been carried out of Corfu as a baby in a wooden fruit crate, stateless, belonging to no one. He had spent 40 years clawing his way to a name that was his. He gave it to the woman he loved on a wedding day the palace called a fairy tale, and the crown took even that. The machinery he had watched at the altar was not an abstraction anymore. It had reached into the nursery. So he raged, quietly, mostly, because there was nowhere for the anger to go. You cannot fight your wife when your wife is the queen. You cannot appeal a decision made by Parliament and precedent and a mother-in-law who outranks you in every room. He wrote letters, he argued with courtiers, and he lost. It would take 14 more years, until 1960, before Elizabeth quietly amended the ruling so that some descendants could carry the name Mountbatten Windsor, a small mercy, granted long after the wound. But the name was only the rehearsal. The real humiliation was scheduled for the 2nd of June, 1953. The coronation of 1953 was the grandest spectacle Britain had staged in a generation. Millions lined the streets. Millions more crowded around the first television sets they had ever owned, because Elizabeth, against the advice of Churchill himself, insisted the cameras be let in. The Abbey again. The same stone floor where 6 years earlier the young naval lieutenant had breathed 6 words. No one was meant to hear, and this time Philip was not standing beside her. He was placed below her. Elizabeth sat enthroned on the raised dais, crowned, holding the orb and the sceptre, the anointed sovereign. And Philip, her husband, the man who had given up his name and his nation for her, was brought forward to kneel. He knelt at her feet. He placed his hands between hers, and he swore the oath of fealty. The oath a subject swears to a monarch, become your liege man of life and limb. He promised to serve her, to defend her, to obey her. Then he rose, touched the crown, kissed her cheek, and stepped back down, away from the throne, to his chair, which sat lower than hers, off to the side, in front of the entire world. On the first coronation ever televised, Philip publicly became his wife's servant. Whatever passed between them in private that day, staff never recorded. But the image was fixed forever. The Queen above, the Duke below, on one knee, and this became the shape of the rest of his life, not a metaphor, a physical fact you can watch across 7 decades of newsreel. At every engagement, every state occasion, every walkabout, Philip walked 1 step behind her, never level, never in front, 1 pace back and slightly to the side, hands often clasped behind him, letting her enter the room first, letting her be seen first, letting her be the one. For more than 60 years of public life, he held that position, the position the coronation had assigned him, the position the machinery required. The courtiers did not thank him for it. They called him difficult, prickly, rude, a man who asked awkward questions and lost his temper and refused to soften himself into the ornamental consort they wanted. The men of the household, the private secretaries and advisers who ran the palace like a private club, never trusted him. He was foreign. He was blunt. He said what he thought. To them he was a problem to be managed, and for years the files and the memoirs painted him exactly that way. The Duke was difficult, but go and read the biographers who came later, the ones who actually weighed the evidence, and a different man appears. Philip was not difficult because he was bitter or vain. He was difficult because he was the only person in the whole gilded operation who refused to pretend. Everyone else played the fairy tale, everyone else smiled and called it a love story with a happy ending and looked away from the cost. Philip would not look away. He had seen the cost at the altar in 1947, and he was not going to stand around applauding a sacrifice as though it cost nothing. His so-called rudeness was, underneath, a kind of honesty the palace could not stomach. So how does a man live inside that, stripped of his name, placed below his wife, walking forever 1 step behind, told by the household he is a nuisance? What does he do with all of it? He filled the gap. That is the only way to describe it. He had energy and pride, and nothing sanctioned to spend them on, so he built himself a role from scratch. He took over the running of the royal estates. He modernised Buckingham Palace, dragged its ancient kitchens and finances into the 20th century. He created the Duke of Edinburgh's award, a scheme that has pushed millions of teenagers up mountains and through hardship and into adulthood. And it carries the name the Crown finally let him keep. He flew planes, he painted, he chaired hundreds of organizations. He restless, always in motion. Because motion was the one thing no one could take from him. And underneath the motion was the devotion. Staff who served the household for decades said the same thing, again and again, in the careful language servants use. He was fiercely loyal to her. Fiercely. But he would never show it in a way the cameras could catch. No public tenderness, no grand declarations. He teased her in private, called her by names no one else dared, made her laugh in a way the crowned queen almost never laughed in public. His love was real and enormous and almost entirely hidden, folded into that one step of distance he never once closed in 60 years. A devotion the staff described as fierce and unshowable. Those two words together, fierce and unshowable. Now go back to the altar, same 6 words. Watch them change meaning. Because here is the turn this whole story has been walking toward. For 70 years those words sounded like a young man's cold verdict. She was never really ours. It sounded like resignation, maybe even resentment. The prince who married a woman and realized on the wedding day that the crown had gotten there first, that he would only ever have a piece of her, that the institution owned the rest. That is how you hear it the first time, as a loss, as a complaint. But read it across 73 years of marriage, and it turns into something else entirely. It was never bitterness. It was the truest thing anyone said on that wedding day. And the palace happened to sell everyone the opposite. Because think about what the sentence actually admits. She was never really ours. Ours. He is not saying she was taken from him. He is saying she was never his to begin with, and he knew it, and he married her anyway. He did not walk into that abbey believing in the fairy tale, and then get robbed of it. He walked in with his eyes open. He looked at the archbishops and the courtiers and the machinery closing around the 21-year-old girl beside him, and he understood in that instant that she belonged to a country, to a crown, to millions of people who would never let her go. He understood he was marrying a woman he could never fully possess, and he did it anyway. That is the whole point. That is the confession buried in 6 words. He did not marry a woman and lose her to a throne. That is the story the tabloids would have wanted. The tragic prince cheated of his bride. It is not what happened. He married a woman who was already promised to the throne before he ever met her, a future queen from the day her uncle abdicated. He knew she came with the crown attached. He knew there would always be a part of her reserved for the nation, a part he would never reach, and knowing all of it, he chose to stand one step behind her for the rest of his life, not because he was forced to, though he was, because he decided to. The kneeling, the name, the pace of distance, he turned every humiliation the machinery handed him into a form of service freely given to a woman he loved without ever fully having. That is not a cage. It is not a fairy tale either. It is something rarer and harder than both. It is a man loving someone he knew from the start he could only ever half hold, and never once letting go. If a story like this one, the version underneath the version you were handed, is what you come here for, then subscribing costs nothing, and there are more of them already waiting. Hit the bell, and the next one finds you. Now let me take you to the end, because the country finally saw, all at once, what one footman heard alone in 1947. In April 2021, Philip died. He was 99, 2 months short of 100, and he died at Windsor with Elizabeth near. 73 years of marriage, the longest of any British sovereign in history. And then came the funeral in St. George's Chapel, and it gave the world one image it will never forget. The pandemic was still on, the rules were strict, and the Queen would not break them for herself. So she sat alone, in a chapel built for her family, surrounded by centuries of Windsor tombs. The 94-year-old woman, who had been Queen for 69 years, sat by herself in a black coat and a black mask, a small figure on a wide, empty bench, saying goodbye to the man who had walked one step behind her since 1947. No one beside her, no one where he had always been. And looking at that photograph, the whole country understood something in a single morning. They saw the distance, they saw the space beside her where he should have been and now never would be. They understood finally what he had given and what she had lost, and what the two of them had actually been to each other underneath 73 years of protocol. The whole country understood it that morning. The Footman understood it in 1947. That is the thing about the 6 words. He said them at the beginning. It took everyone else the entire length of the marriage, right up to the moment she sat alone on that bench, to hear what he already knew. So go back one last time. Westminster Abbey, the 20th of November, 1947. A footman stationed near the choir screen, close enough to hear. Princess Elizabeth moving toward the altar in ivory silk, while the nation held its breath and called it a fairy tale. And the young naval lieutenant beside her, 26 years old, stateless, name borrowed, everything given up, leaning a fraction of an inch and breathing 6 words, meant for no one. She was never really ours. The palace sold a wedding. The man at the centre of it saw the truth and said it out loud, once quietly, and then spent the next 73 years living up to it. She belonged to all of them, to the country, to the crown, to the millions who lined the streets and crowded the television sets and wept at the funeral. That was always going to be true. Philip never fought it. He simply loved her entirely, and out of sight, one step behind, without ever fully having her. She was never really ours. He knew it first, and in the end, it was the most faithful thing anyone ever said about that marriage.